Hello, everyone. My name is Seth Dellinger, and this is the Embodied Dialogue podcast. I'm very happy that I'm here today with Christopher Mastropietro. And Christopher has done many really fascinating things that I want to talk to him about. But he is the co-author of a book called Zombies and Western Culture, a 21st Century Crisis. And just that title might make you very curious. And he's often known for his work with the cognitive scientist and cognitive psychologist John Vervaeke, who has coined a term, the meaning crisis, and that book is related to the meaning crisis. But the way I know of Christopher is also a practice that Christopher and John and also Guy Sengstock, who is the creator of the practice of circling, and many other people have been developing, which is called Dialectic into Dialogos. And I've learned that I probably shouldn't try to say what that is in 2 quick sentences, but it's something we'll get into in this discussion. And I know that that's not the complete biography, so I'm going to ask you something about it. But first, let me just say welcome, Christopher. Really glad you're here.
That's great. That'll do fine. Thank you, Seth.
Yeah,
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet you. You and I have met before, so pleasure to meet you. Talk to you.
Right. Well, I was in the Dialogos.
That's
workshop,
right. So very briefly we met.
Yeah.
Very
so
briefly.
To the degree that you can meet in a Zoom room with 100 people in it, but as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I know that you also have some background, and I don't know how extensive it is, but you were involved in theater. And so, because in part, many people know the work that you do with John Vervaeke, but I'd love to go back before you knew John and just get a little bit of your backstory, and maybe theater is a piece of it, but then maybe you could also, in whatever amount of detail you want, say, how does that connect eventually to the question of the meaning crisis and this practice of Dialogos, which the one thing I'll say just for anyone brand new is it's a conversation, Dialogos, but it's a very special kind of conversation. So
yeah, it's a very difficult thing to do. There are so many ways to define it. You and I were just talking about that before you hit record. Defining it is perennially a tricky thing. But yeah, so I did. So the sort of the story of it is quite straightforward. I mean, I met John because I was at the U of T as a student, and he was teaching there, and I met him very, in circumstances that were very unassuming, and just ended up being like scores of people before and after since have been. I was just very struck by the way in which he reintroduced me to philosophy as something that had great import, and not that as something that was sterile and purely intellectual. And maybe we can get there. But yeah, you asked about the theater. The theater, it's funny. It's not something I've done for some time, but I did it at a time when it was quite formative. I did it through adolescence into sort of my early 20s a little bit, at a time when you are host to a cacophony of different forces and influences and powers and inhibitions and insecurities and all kinds of things that are jockeying for position and jockeying to speak on your behalf and to act on your behalf. And so it became a way of becoming conscious of those and learning to begin to manage those sum of forces in the interior that need to somehow find their way into an acoustic space.
Did it begin like, were you acting in high school? Were you acting
I was
youth? Or
I was, and I did a mentorship program when I was a teenager with a theater company here in Toronto that was, and now even more so, is quite prominent, a classical theater company. And that was a very intensive, not only an intensive artistic experience because it involved various performing arts. It didn't just involve theater, it involved dance, it involved writing, it involved improvisation, it involved all kinds of things that are meant to basically kick up the dust inside of you and force you into very, very vulnerable company with other people. I mean, that's probably theater, as I became exposed to it, was a training in vulnerability.
Well, I think most people can
could
imagine feeling vulnerable standing on a stage in front of an audience,
Well,
trying to say the lines they memorized. I mean, just for the layperson who did one high school play, it's like, oh yeah, I felt vulnerable. But you're talking about something deeper. I'm getting.
I'm not talking so much about performing, although performing certainly has its own fun and its own kind of vulnerability. But I mean the process of workshopping, the process of rehearsing, the process of whether you're starting with a script and trying to bring it to fruition, or you're starting with something completely open-ended. A lot of the activities and the games and the exercises, a lot of those things that I learned to do during that very formative period, especially things around improvisation and whatnot. Movement is a big part of it. Becoming aware of yourself through movement is a big part of it. Becoming aware of the relationship between your body and your voice, between your voice and your intent, your intentionality, or the way in which you pursue objectives, the way in which you instinctively react to people opposite you. Learning when you have yourself in a grip that is itself inhibitive of your own movement, of your own speech, of your own action, of a certain amount of an authentic capacity to react. A lot of it is about finding the knots inside of you and trying to slowly untie them. Now, sometimes it can be guilty of tying its own knots. It's like any art form. It has its own lacunas and it has its own traps. So, it, for every knot it unties, it can tie another. And for every inhibition it manages to bring into consciousness.
Yeah, it's like we can get seduced by a really amazing technique and then it becomes our Bible or something like that. Yeah.
That's right. So, I mean, as time went on, I realized that it was a remarkably, it was a remarkably intimate experience, and something that I loosened me up quite a bit. But at the same time, it also presented because anytime you do something, I mean, I'm sure I'd be interested in knowing how this observation resonates with your experience. But especially at that sort of age, when you do something that is immediately evocative of vulnerability, that's kind of emotionally charged by nature, and that also brings you into confrontation with your own set of interior inhibitions that aren't always nameable to you, especially when you're young. It can become a very mercurial thing. It can create incredible eruptions of insight and intimacy, but what it also does is it can be a very neurotic enterprise as well.
I just want to pause you because Mercurial is above my pay grade. What do you mean it's a Mercurial?
It's like, I mean that it involves a lot of volatile changes of mood, of temperament, of humor. There's a lot of changeability to it, right?
There's something that's a little beyond my control, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And one of the things that you find when you do that is that there are things start coming out of you that you didn't expect to come out of you. It's like you begin to figure out that, okay, there's a host, like I said, there's a host of different forces and influences that are somehow there's a kind of there's a force of motion that is keeping these all in tension in relation to one another. And the thing is that when you come into tension, into tense and intimate relation with other people in your environment, so I discovered, what happens is that you're beginning to you learn to relate to yourself as you learn to relate to other people, and the two processes are happening virtually in parallel. And so one of the things that it taught me was that you're forced to kind of become aware when it is that you're speaking to somebody else and when it is that you're actually speaking into yourself, when you're in the throes of that kind of art form and that kind of activity. right? Because you're forced back on your heels. There's a part of you that's forced to confront all of those influences that are threatening to speak and express on your behalf. But at the same time, you're trying to maintain a certain tension and a continuity of contact with the people around you. And so your relationship with yourself and your relationship with your, let's say, your troop or your colleagues or your cohort, whatever they may be, your friends, certainly, all of it is happening in such a way that the lines between what it is that is happening to your relation with yourself and whatever it is that's happening to your relationship with your peers is all being collapsed together. And so what it does is it creates a great deal of raw material to then work through. It creates a great deal of intimacy. What it does is it's exceptionally effective at creating relationships. I mean, right?
Right, because all your friends are going through this too. So it's not just like I'm having a rich experience. It's like you're doing this too. And then we're comparing notes. So then
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And there are, when we did those Dialogos weekends, the kind of instant, and obviously this has a lot to do with the influence of circling, of course, but in that case, but this idea of in such short order and such a short span of time, suddenly developing or coming into a kind of spontaneous intimacy with people that you perhaps didn't know very well before, and feeling a charge of kinship between them. And that charge of kinship can avail a lot of cooperative, productive activity. What it can also do, though, it can avail all kinds of other things, projections and resentments and insecurities, right? Coming into a charged tension with other people. It's the kind of thing that the dramatic arts invoke by necessity as a matter of course.
So but I want to jump in just for, sorry.
No, it's okay. Please.
Just because I want to imagine someone listening who has no idea what Dialogos or circling or the meaning crisis is, because I referred to it. But what I'm hearing, because I do know about, I've had some involvement, otherwise I wouldn't be talking to you. But what I'm hearing, and because I asked, well, how'd you go from theater to philosophy and working with John Vervaeke and this magical conversation thing we're calling Dialogos that someone out there is still wondering what it is. But what I heard in your description of the experience of just being a young person, figuring out life and being involved in theater and improvisation and writing and self-expression and dialogue, and how at times it was uncomfortable, but I imagine sitting with the discomfort, there were moments where you figured things out. You talked about something comes out of my mouth that I didn't even know it was going to come out. But then after it happens, you can kind of look back and like, oh, I'm capable of a thing I didn't know I was capable of. Like there's a kind of a transformative process that you're talking about. It's winding here and there. And before we turned on recording, I said to you, hey, Christopher, I know you've done tons of reading of philosophy and you're steeped in it, but I'm not. And yet, another thing that's a real bridge when you were talking about acting and the relationship of your body to your voice and whatnot. And I pointed at my skeleton because I'm a practitioner of the Feldenkrais method, which is all about recognizing, you were describing it, like how we tie ourselves in knots or how we get tied to a technique and then tie, but we can, if we pay attention, we can untie those knots and all these. And we were talking about Moshe Feldenkrais. He's a long story, but I'll just share with you something I didn't say before, which is this guy who came up with this very interesting, we might say, dialogical way of working with the body, but also understanding that the body and the mind and our relationships and the world, they're all in a system together. He actually at one point said, if I could live another life, what I would want to do above all, I would want to be an actor, because he admired people who could take on a new character, who could become, I don't know, Othello or something. They could just become this other person. And then in the next production, they could become a different person. And then this time they're old, and this time they're young, and this time they're irritable, and this time they're serene. And, he thought that was amazing. But if we move our conversation forward a little bit, what is the meaning crisis? And I'll give it a little go for myself, but there's many levels to it. But I think anyone kind of looking around these days, from Ukraine to like political discourse in the United States, all kinds of things, we know, like, wow, there's a mess, the environment. But what you and John Vervaeke and others have really zeroed in on quite a bit is this phrase, the meaning crisis. Sure, there's all these practical problems that humanity needs to solve, but before we can solve them, we actually have to be able to communicate with each other. And that's kind of falling apart. And, we could say, to just draw on some of what you've been talking about, like, if I'm really going to communicate with you, I have to get vulnerable. I actually have to be willing to discover that all of my great ideas, some of them are wrong. And then, like, if I find that out, I have to be willing to, like, admit that or whatever. Or, when we use particular words, we were talking about this before. John has a whole series that you were part of called, what's it called? The elusive I, and this idea of I, or the self, or the mind. Well, we could spend all day defining those things, and we could spend all day arguing about those things. And if we were really paying attention, we might notice, well, the problem is we're actually talking about two different things, but we have one word that means who knows how many different things. So I'm kind of fast forwarding here, but these days you are engaged with this question, I think, of utmost importance to humanity, this situation that we're all living in this culture. And swirling around all of these issues is this issue of meaning. Mm-hmm. And so Dialogos, and I'm going to hand it back to you to maybe say to someone who's never been to a workshop like I did with you, but what are you, or what do you see that you and others who you're collaborating with are doing right now in terms of drawing on the philosophical tradition, but also even in conversations like you and I are having? How is this related to that crisis in the world? And why is the way we speak, the way we communicate, vulnerability, what do all these things have to do with each other?
Right. That's a good question. I can only attempt an answer at that. It's very complex, as you know, but
well, I didn't make it a short and sweet question, did I?
A short and sweet. So, well, it's okay. I mean, one way of thinking about it is, and let me make the bridge, because you asked me about this asked me about the dramatic arts, and I want to. That would be great. And make a proper connection. Why was I talking about all of that? Why were you asking about it? So one of the reasons is that learning about your own capacity to deport your character, to constitute yourself in different ways, has a lot to do with then what opens to you, what opens to your perception, what becomes available to your reason, what becomes available to your ability to actually apprehend things and think them through. All of that has to do with a fundamental disposition that determines what in the field is salient and what is available, right? Like there's sort of an old Platonic and Augustinian idea, an idea that very much, I would say, originated in the Platonic tradition, of this idea that our sight, our soul, there's a kind of a power of sight that our soul has. In other words, our relationship we have with the world, and I mean, this insight has been repeated by many, many other traditions. I don't mean it's an exclusively Platonic idea, but Plato and Platonism has its version of this idea. The idea being that, you can almost imagine it as the beam of attention that comes out of our eyes that determines the way the world presents back to us, right? It's a very simple, fundamental insight, and it's pervasive through a lot of different traditions, but fundamentally it has to do with the fact the way we constitute our attention has everything to do with the way the world comes into focus. and the way other people come into focus. And so the Socratic tradition, the tradition of Socratic dialogue, of which Dialogos is a contemporary renaissance, is the idea of training attention by training the character of interaction between people when they understand their perspectives to be incomplete and they engage in a mutual project of deepening their scope and capacity to pay attention by using one another as the criterion for expanding that attention, developing it, training it, appreciating it. And because each individual is rather mysterious and infinite as a container of possibility, what happens in Dialogos is that the people who are conversing use each other's containers of mystery as a way of approximating the mystery of, however we want to put it, the mysteries of being itself or the mysteries of life itself. So that you use people, a social context, as a way of approximating the dynamic of what we might call a more ontological context, which has to do with the nature of what is most real, what is most ultimate, what is the nature of being as we encounter it and ourselves and others in the world. And so
these being the kind of classical questions of the domain that we call philosophy.
Right. And so Dialogos is a kind of formalizes the problem, how to interact with oneself in the world within a social context of using dialogue as a way to tutor and train our way of relating to other people and our way of relating to ourselves.
And just one more piece about like why you and I are talking that hopefully won't be a detour, but we were also talking before hitting record about what do people out there think is philosophy? And I said, well, in my case, I haven't encountered much philosophy. Not that I didn't encounter it, but when I did, it just looked like this dry thing that people do at a university, and it isn't good for much. And of course, that's not been your experience, what you were just talking about in terms of understanding reality and how, even back when you were talking about being a young person and trying to figure out social life, that's also a manner of like trying to figure out reality. But in terms of the meaning crisis, maybe this idea that these big questions that philosophy historically has asked for a lot of the population, they're just not even discussed. It's like, why would I want to discuss reality all day? What does that have to do? And yet it's so important.
Right.
And so I just sort of like raised my hand as like an example of a person who didn't know why this was important, but Dialogos, this conversational practice, where, for example, and this is a shortcut a little bit, but in a Dialogos practice, if you and I were doing, and I guess the correct name would be a dialectic into Dialogos, because Dialogos is a special moment that might or might not occur. It's not like we can snap our fingers and do Dialogos.
That's right.
But to really speak in shorthand, you and I, or maybe you and I and two other people, if we were discussing at length honesty, or we were discussing at length humility or courage or some of the virtues, we might be doing this practice. And so I hopefully you can come back to where you were, but that's just, again, to put some flesh on it, because I might have a certain idea of courage, but it might be a kind of a rigid idea. And then I talk to you and I run into the limitations of my idea and what.
Yeah. And what is the relationship between the idea of courage that you had before the conversation and the way in which you've been acting out courageously or uncourageously, right? One of the things that's very tricky is the relationship between the performative contradictions between what we profess and what we live out, and they're often very different. But one of the things that the traditional Socratic dialogue brings into distinction are those very contradictions. And so a couple of ways in here. One is that, so to the completely uninitiated when it comes to philosophy, one way of understanding its efficacy is to realize, so this is again going back to the Socratic tradition, is this idea that we, all of us, no matter our station, no matter how wise or how knowledgeable we might be, we have all through the incidents of living, we've all acquired beliefs. We've acquired not beliefs in the sense of presumed facts about the world, not something that could be rounded up in a kind of trivia, but we've acquired beliefs in the sense of worldviews, ways of understanding the way things are and the way we are, that have sort of absorbed into us, right? We've acquired beliefs that are not actually necessary. They're not essential, and they're not, certainly not exhaustively true in any sense, right? Our idea of ourselves and our idea of what the world is at any given time are always impoverished. But we don't necessarily carry on. We don't go around thinking in that way. We don't go around thinking of ourselves as exhausted in our capacity to understand things, right? We have working models of the way things are, and we put them into practice because we all have to live and manage time and do practical things and be persons. But what the Socratic tradition reintroduces is the idea that we all labor under the specter of these false beliefs, false insofar as they're not exhaustive, false insofar as they give us a partial and sort of torqued version of what is. And even if we can't ever attain, in fact, and you certainly couldn't attain the full measure of the intelligibility of a thing or a problem or a person, there is an ongoing developmental project in the Socratic tradition of continuing to emancipate yourself from those confining beliefs, those perspectives, those modes of engagement, those characters, right? Because there's a reason in Plato's Dialogues why dispositions of belief are represented by characters. It's really, really important. It's one of the ways in which the dramatic arts connects to the philosophy. When we understand ideas as when we can't understand how ideas are personated, right? When we think of them as though they were logical formulas or formulations, right? Or something that is disembodied and abstract and has no behavioral correspondent, then ideas become quite boring, right? And it's no wonder that someone who's exposed to academic philosophy fails to see the relevance and fails to see the import. But one of the things that comes from the Platonic tradition, which I think is now very much part of the Dialectic into Dialogos practice, is the idea that the disposition of character and the orientation of belief and what they produce, what they make available, are inseparable, right? And so the Socratic dialogue is a training of character, because when you're subjecting a certain virtue to the Socratic elenchus, the process of Socratic dialogue, you're trying to determine what your relationship to that virtue erstwhile has been up to that point.
Right.
And you're trying to imagine the possibility that your abbreviated understanding of that virtue could in fact have produced an abbreviated way of seeing all kinds of things when they've been filtered through the prism of that insufficient belief, right?
Right.
So it's the idea that coming into a fuller understanding of a virtue, it's not simply that I now have a kind of intellectual appreciation. It's recursive and it's reflexive. It rebounds back upon me. If I suddenly find that there's more to something, if I find the more to something I knew only in part, I also find the more of myself that couldn't be made known to me until it was given the light of that greater understanding to come into its own.
At this point, like, I think what you're describing is really clear in terms of like how I, as an individual, benefit from going into open-ended dialogue with another person whose views are different than me. And furthermore, in fact, there's a tradition of people doing this in a very conscious way, which Dialectic into Dialogos is reviving. But then when we talk about the meaning crisis, and I think it's pretty easy to see, like, if I have all these deficiencies and I never do anything about them, it doesn't just affect me, it affects everyone around me, because I'm bumbling around with these beliefs that I haven't really tested out fully. John Vervaeke has this nice sort of short and sweet thing he likes to talk about to address this issue that philosophy is kind of like this dry thing. And he says, well, if you do the etymology, it's philosophia, which means the love of wisdom. But there's another Greek, I think, term, philonikeia, and Nikeia is victory. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I'm just repeating what I've heard John say. But if I'm talking to you and I love victory, what's more important than learning is that I defeat you in the argument. I'm the victor. And, and if I'm really tied to my belief and I'm not open, even if I don't think I'm trying to defeat you as a person, like I'm not going to surrender my belief. So even defensively, I'm fighting, as opposed to like actually being curious about the holes in what I'm thinking, because that's an opportunity for me. And so, like I mentioned, the state of political discourse in the world and all, given all the problems. So that, I think, might be a bridge into like why this is also, for us as a culture, this practice is so relevant. And I told you I was going to do this. You wrote a paper along with John. It's called Gnosis in the second person. And if you want, you can unpack the title for people if you think that's helpful, or we could just let them, we could put a link to it if people want to read it. And you and I had a little interesting discussion before about, like, I told you I was reading it and I was looking up a lot of words in the dictionary to understand it. So there's a way that, someone who's new might go, oh my gosh, and yet there's so much value in what you're talking about. So I wanted to pick a couple of little quotations that, might be a way in to just really continue our conversation. But so if that's okay, I'm just going to read one now and invite you to respond and to the other things we've been talking about. But you wrote, in the authentic discourse, you cannot know without also being known, cannot be known without also being changed, and cannot be changed without changing your capacity to know.
So that certainly is not an insight that is original or unique to John and I. Perhaps that particular formulation is, but ultimately, again, this is a very Platonic idea, and also ultimately that iteration of it is also very prominent in Augustine, which is this idea that your capacity to speak, your capacity to be able to compass ideas in speech and to be able to formulate something in speech is very, very dependent upon the ear that is going to be receiving it, right? That the pragmatics of speech are just as significant as the semantics of speech. So I could put it that way, right? So everything that is in the offing of an encounter, in the margins between you and this other person, what's the nature of that relationship? Is it a relationship of trust? Is it one that's going to circumscribe or foreclose you by filing you under a categorical identity or a heading that will restrict your capacity to be in any other way? What are the conditions that set the terms and the possibility between two people when they're sitting down to have a conversation? Those pragmatic elements will be just as forceful in determining the capacity of that conversation as either of the as much as the ability of each of those people to formulate their ideas. Right? So the idea behind this is that if we give one another our attention, truly give one another our attention, the kind of attention that will see more in whatever is said, that will look past the person's profile to the silhouette of whatever it is that is in and behind and around that person, right? Because we are all a great deal more than what we present as personae, because there's a great deal more of us than what is proffered at any given moment in time. The idea behind that turn of phrase, or that proposal, is that the way in which the interaction is conditioned in its fundamental attitude will have everything to do with its capacity to change the two people that are coming to participate. And the idea of being known, I mean, imagine, it's a very straightforward metaphor, but imagine that each person that you're doing a dialogic interaction with is a mirror for you, and as rich and as expansive and as reflective that mirror can be, the more of yourself will be returned to you. And not only will more of yourself be returned to you, but the more of yourself that is returned to you will in turn allow you a far, far more generous latitude to be able to pick up what is in front of you in the other person, which will in turn enrich that person's capacity to pick up the more of you. That's what John calls reciprocal opening.
We might also harken back to the term you used before, which is just vulnerability too, right? Like if I'm more vulnerable, it's like I'm more generous in showing you who I am. And then it's like you have more of me to dance with, because I've actually allowed you to see that part where, as if I was closed off, I might not do. Or if I just assumed, we're talking for the first time, but I've seen you in the workshop, and if I had thought, well, I've got Christopher all figured out, like I've already limited this conversation too. So like in the negative, we could do that. I want to turn it right back to, but another, I think, a little useful phrase that John uses, he talks about this practice of dialectic into dialogos, and he says, how when you're meditating, you notice at times that you get distracted and you forgot about your breath and you're distracted. He says, well, when you're doing dialectic into dialogos, or I think we could just say when you're talking to someone, there's something you do called projection, which is like that part where I'm like, yeah, I've got Christopher figured out. Mm-hmm. And it's the same error as the distraction during the meditation, where I've zeroed down onto, I'm thinking about what I'm going to make for dinner, and I'm no longer open to something larger. So I just wanted to sort of bring that in.
Yes, exactly. So those are two good points. So the first one about the vulnerability, I think that's exactly right. But the vulnerability is, I think it's both a byproduct of the process when I think we're doing it well, but it's also a precondition for the process. And it doesn't have only to do with disclosure, but it has to do also with the capacity to listen, right?
Yeah.
Being silent can be a remarkably vulnerable thing to do, especially because most of us assuage our vulnerability precisely with speech, right? Silence is a really significant component of that practice, because both people have to be attuned to the fact that whatever it is they might presume of the other, both in their capacity to speak and in their capacity to understand, is not what they expect. And so, yes, for both parties, or for all parties in a case where there's more people involved, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm sorry, the second point you made, just refresh me, Seth, about
was about projection.
Projection. Yeah. Because that's another thing. Because, like I said this about the dramatic arts, but Dialogos is to some degree, is a dramatic art, just like the Socratic dialogues are, right? They are dramatic arts. That's not all they are, but they are that in part, which means that you're having an interaction that is reflexive while you're having an interaction that is social. And anytime you're having a reflexive reaction or a reflexive interaction and a social interaction at the same time, the two can become unduly conflated. And the other person can be clothed with a role that's happening as part of an interior dynamic, and that other person is given a role in your own personal little psychodrama,
right,
that you're
I'm just
playing
reminded,
out
actually,
as you're playing out the dialogues. And so that's why it's a remarkably complex process, because from the perspective of the I, the individual, the people that you're dialoguing with are projected aspects of yourself, right? And that doesn't mean that the whole exercise is confined to the interior of psychic life. I don't mean that, but one of the axes, that's going on. On another of the axes, this is a very, very social interpenetration. And so the projection, I think, happens when those two become conflated, when the social interaction becomes imbued with the dramatic leavings of the internal drama. And that's what we see. And so one of the things that Dialogos, I hope, can be helpful to do, not only is to kick up and evoke that reflexive interior drama, which happens as we come into more of an awareness of ourselves, kind of like what you described to me with the movement earlier, of helping people to realize, to become aware of the way that they move, such that they might be able to be more self-possessed in how they move and what they move.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very similar concept. I think right. And it's just a matter of knowing, okay, on what axis is this actually taking place?
So I want to try to see, again, if I could just tie a few things together. And you reminded me of a specific question about the practice of dialectic into Dialogos that I'd love to ask. First of all, when you were speaking about, the silence, leave a little silence just for, but that we both have to be attuned to something. And in everyday life, it's like someone says it and they call it like the mic drop or something. Someone says something surprising and then there's that moment no one speaks, but then what is the energy? And everyone's listening into it. When we said before in our conversation that dialectic into Dialogos, if you hear those three words, dialectic is, without even completely describing it, you might say it's a set of things that we agree to do to get a ball rolling. And then Dialogos is a thing that might occur. Yeah. And the Dialogos, let's just say that thing that might occur, it's in that space between us. It's not always silent, but it's not you and it's not me. It's a third entity which we're listening in for. It could, this is the place where for some people it gets spiritual, and, or
Mhm.
there are practices related to this practice where you might be looking at a text, but the person who wrote the text might have passed away 300 years ago, but we kind of think, well, that voice is here between us because we're talking about it, but we're reading those words. So Guy Sengstock, who is another one of the key people, running these workshops, and he's the person who created the practice of circling, which is, it's got a lot, there's a strong relationship between circling and dialogos, but circling tends to be, again, if we shorthand it and say it's a conversation, it tends to be a conversation where someone's giving a lot of autobiography. If you were circling me, you might be asking me what's going on in my life. I'd be describing it, but the kind of listening you would be doing might be very much the similar thing to what we're talking about with dialectic into dialogos, where we might actually be talking about, as we said, honesty or courage or reverence or something like this. But what's interesting, and this comes back to this question of projection, but also there's a very specific instruction that you're giving in the workshops for dialectic into dialogos, which I wanted to ask about, which is, we're having a discussion and we're listening into this sort of invisible third entity that's somewhere in between us. And if we feel like it comes alive, if we start following something, if people go on to YouTube and watch, they put Dialogos, there's a series of conversations, especially with you, Jordan Hall, Guy Sengstock, and John Vervaeke, who I think these are exemplary, because if someone watched those videos and turned off the sound, they just watched your faces, they'd see you guys are like, you're like following some kind of thread there, and like there's all this movement and there's this energy, and you can just see that there's something. It's not just four guys talking, like there's something else going on there. Mm-hmm. And that's like Dialogos kind of caught fire, and there's something going on. But the beginning point, again, the dialectic part, the sort of procedural part, is we're going to talk about a virtue. We're going to talk about honesty, let's say. But then one of the specific instructions that's given, because someone's going to propose what they think honesty is, another person's going to listen, they're going to bounce it back and forth, and someone else is going to have a turn, and someone else is going to have a turn, and something's going to build. But one of the specific instructions is, when you're discussing honesty, don't go into your personal story. Don't talk about your biography. So I've experientially learned a little bit why I think that makes sense. But as someone who's giving this instruction and leading this workshops, why that instruction? Why shouldn't I say, oh, honesty, let me tell you about a time that this happened to me? Why is that not actually something that's invited into the practice?
That's a really good question. Incidentally, your description of Dialogos, it was really, really good. So I think you have the measure of it. I really do. So one reason I think is that because Dialogos is meant to be, I'll use this term and then I'll explain what I mean by it. But because it's meant to be a trans-egoic experience, meaning that it's not just a bunch of people and their repertoires of skills and beliefs and aptitudes that are coming to share with one another and get to know one another better. That's not the project. It can very easily be confused for the project because there are all kinds of other practices and traditions that involve exactly that are whose aims are social, whose fundamental objective is social, and whose goal is to create community by ingratiating people with one another and by initiating what will hopefully be longer term relationships. The point of Dialogos isn't to get to know everybody better. Although that does sometimes happen, and it's wonderful when it does, it's not primarily a social exercise. One of the things that can sometimes happen when we lapse into talking about ourselves is that what we do is we involuntarily rig the process so that it feeds back and refers itself back to the personas that we have when we've entered the arena, right? You've entered in this is who I am. These are my particular traits. This is the kind of the crest of myself that I'm bringing into the conversation. And if I want to make the conversation about that, what I'm going to do is I could end up subjecting the conversation to a denominator that is closed-ended rather than open-ended, that has a terminus, that has a finality, and that has a kind of intended consequence or an intended meaning. Usually when I talk about myself, it's because I want someone to understand me in the precise terms that I'm using to talk about myself. But because one of the objectives of being in Dialogos is to disabuse ourselves of some of those premises that we're using to describe ourselves in the first place. One of the problems of self-reporting is that it's often not accurate, right? We report things about ourselves all the time that turn out to be a little bit less than true. And that's true of all of us, right? And so because one of the aims in Dialogos is to use the presence of a dynamic that emerges spontaneously between people as a way of reflecting on ourselves and being rebounded upon ourselves. We try and set aside autobiography so that recourse to autobiography doesn't foreclose the process of learning things about ourselves we didn't already know, and doesn't prevent us from paying the proper attention to the people around us, which we're much more likely to do when the nominal subject of conversation is something that is already shared between us and not something that is relegated to the domain of one person.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
There's something that Guy says often, and because I've joined his training and I'm trying to learn this art of circling, which he teaches, I listen up when he gives certain cues, but I've heard him say this many times, talking about Dialogos is like, and as someone involved in theater, you know that there's all kinds of programs to practice speaking, right? But Guy often talks about, we don't often practice listening, like as a formal thing. And even though we're talking about, this is a dialogical process, like we're exchanging words, a big piece of it is this listening. And the phrase from Guy that he uses, he tells a story, he might have got this from someone else, but it made an impression on him. However, it came, well, I guess that you might even say it's an example of the logos, like, was it Guy, or was it the Platonic tradition, or where did it come from? But anyway, the idea that, in his words, is, he says, you know when you're listening, or when listening begins, it's when you realize you're not listening. Yeah. That's when listening begins.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's perfect, and it's beautiful. And you know what? That core insight can be then translated and dilated up to encompass so many other features of the process. Yeah. For instance, when we're talking about this process of self-awareness and self-discovery, people begin to become aware of themselves when they realize that they weren't, in fact, being themselves at all, right? When they were acting out patterns or living out patterns or speaking out patterns that they had acquired by means that aren't even recollectable in the first place. It's like, I had this idea about something. Where did I get it? I don't even know, but I have it and I live by it. I live by this set of presumptions about the way something works, or the way I'm supposed to be, right? It's like you were using the example of, like, every time I tilt my head to the left, every time I'm
trying to go down the middle and I don't realize that I have this bias to one side. Left.
Exactly. I never realized that about myself, that I have this strange torque to my movement. It's the same thing, right? And when we realize that what we presumed, both about ourselves and perhaps about someone else, or perhaps about the state of things in general, suddenly isn't equal to the felt character of the reality that we now witness of ourselves and of other people, that is the aporia, right? That moment when the limits of our presumed knowledge and belief are reached and exceeded. And now suddenly we have to begin again, right?
Yeah.
Because we've suddenly realized that we've come up short when we bring everything we feel is true to bear and still come up short. Something needs to be overwritten and overwritten and overwritten and overwritten, right? And that's the process of the Socratic dialogue.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, I think it has been, it's not a kind of, it's not a bunch of people like, stroking their chins and asking questions for the sake of it. It's trying to constantly refresh the capacity to remember how insufficient the frames are through which we act and look at ourselves and at one another. And we have to continually elasticize those boundaries so that our attention has the chance, like has a fighting chance to actually acquire a sense of participation that can return to us a fuller experience of ourselves, right? And so that's the goal anyway.
Yeah. So I'll use that as a segue, just that word participation. I want to read again from your paper. And, I kind of said something before about looking up all these words in the dictionary. And I certainly don't want to scare anyone off. I think people should read this paper if they're finding what you're talking about interesting. But the reason I brought that up was also to say, and as I told you before, I have the same issue when I talk to someone about the Feldenkrais method, which is it's like a whole world of approaching movement. You were referring to it with the movement of the head that you discover is to the side, and then how do you do that? And then you use the term aporia, which comes from philosophy. But as I told you, there's one of the Feldenkrais trainers who referred to this movement practice as a sort of a Socratic inquiry where we can discover like a bodily aporia, like that moment where I didn't even realize I was tilting to the side. And now you're asking me to tilt to the other side, and I'm discovering I don't know how to do that. So it's like maybe in everyday language, it's like confusion. And someone might say, why would I want to invite myself into confusion? That's the last thing. I don't enjoy that. And yet there's this opportunity, which Feldenkrais saw, and I feel, in this practice. Anyway, so I want to read another quote, which is there's a little bit of a mouthful. And so I'll say that ahead of time, but I really think people, and I'm seeing the time, and we'll probably have to make this our last little piece, but John Vervaeke often talks about what he calls the 4 Ps of knowing. And this again relates to the meaning crisis, because in short, the first one, propositional knowing, it's kind of like what we've been talking about. I've got these ideas, I'm going to tell you what they are. And he talks about, we're stuck in just that one. And so what this quotation does is it explains a little bit, it references John's 4 Ps of knowing, but it also puts it into, I think this is kind of could be a description of dialectic into Dialogos, because it uses this phrase authentic dialogue, which might be an umbrella term, which would also refer to circling and other kinds of practices. There's many practices these days where people are looking at these things. So anyway, I'll just read it, but then I'd love to hear you respond and just help anyone who wouldn't immediately get it. So you wrote, a new form of authentic dialoguing will be incomplete without a comprehending system of 1, propositions, enacted by 2, procedures, embodied by 3, perspectives, embedded in 4, participation. I can read it again just with little, so people might want to just hear it twice. A new form of authentic dialoguing will be incomplete without a comprehending system of propositions, enacted by procedures, embodied by perspectives, embedded in participation.
Yeah, so the four Ps are certainly John's typology, and that's something he came up with. Although this paper, I think, was the first time that he and I wrote. I think was the first time that idea or that framework of his was actually published. So I suppose
Okay.
that's significant. So to that degree, I suppose I published it with him. But the fundamental framework is his, and so the idea being that we here now tend to live very much under a kind of a propositional tyranny. The idea being that statements that can be considered true or false, facts that can be adduced as trivia, things that we could say, statements we could make that could be given a kind of quantitative value, all fall under the scope of propositional knowing, right? The kind of knowing that can be expressed in propositions. Now, the point that John is trying to make by this framework is that the ways in which we know are articulated out across multiple domains and along a continuum that has everything to do with that have to do with what mode is being engaged, right? What mode of being, what mode of participation is being engaged. And so those ways of knowing are basically stratified to give a more complete sense of the various ways in which we encounter the world. Procedure is the knowing how to do something, right? The kind of knowing that allows you to be able to catch a ball or stretch in the morning or break into a sprint very suddenly, or fold a piece of paper or something like that, right? It's the kind of embodied movement that we do that has absolutely no propositional analog, right? They're not there's nothing about it that can be true or false. Its nature is verbal, as of a verb, right? It's movement. It's something that is, it's a form of knowing that is expressed in an embodied way that has no reference to propositions. And then there's perspectival, and perspectival knowing is the knowing what it is like to be, what it means to be situated within a particular set of constraints or with a particular set of affordances, right? What is it like to be in this particular situation as this person, as this time? What is afforded to me as a consequence of that knowing? The knowing. It
seemed to me as an actor, it knows something about perspectival, because totally. Now I'm being this character, now I'm being this character.
Yeah. And virtually all of I think all of the little tricks of the trade that performers use, all of those little technical practices that they cultivate, all have to do with basically getting into that perspectival knowing, right? Situating them properly. Because being situated in a perspective means having a particular goal, having a particular set of constraints. They might be fears or inhibitions, or they might be very practical obstacles, right? Knowing what is available to you, knowing what is repelling you, and what is the particular affective nature or the subjective character of experience that is produced as a consequence of being in that situation. And then how does that affect the procedural knowing of what kind of movement is available to you? And then how does that affect the propositional knowing of what is likely to be spoken in such a situation that is confined by those set of constraints or those set of enablers? So these levels are all threaded, right? They're all kind of interconnected. And the
participation was the last.
Right. And the participatory is basically that fundamental modality that grounds out all of the others, right? Which is fundamentally the experience of being involved in the activity itself.
Right.
Right.
You don't have the quotation in front of you. I do, but in fact, we won't try to do this now because we're running out of time. But there's also this quotation talks about the 4 E's of cognitive sciences. If I read it right, but if people know John Vervaeke or they want to look up the 4E cognitive science, but again, it's talking about a new form of authentic dialogue. I just want to put in how this sentence puts together those 4 P's. You said a comprehending system of propositions. So like we are discussing ideas, maybe we're discussing a virtue, I've got an idea about it, you've got an idea about it, but then it says this system is enacted by procedures. And so like in Dialogos, I mentioned one person gives a proposal, another one listens, there's a way that it goes around the circle, there's a procedure that is set up.
Yeah.
But then it's just reading further, it's embodied by perspectives. It's when I'm speaking, it's embodied by my perspective. When you're speaking, it's embodied by yours. And then, the next person, her perspective. And then all of this is embedded in participation. Like maybe that's the place where the Dialogos comes alive. And when I talk about those videos where the 4 of you seem to be like, suddenly you're participating in something. And
right.
like, we don't know what that is until the very moment that we're participating.
That it happens. Yeah. And it's kind of like a coextension of identity. And all of the other things help to prepare it, right? Those other P's are sort of like the kindling that goes in preparation for the flame. And hopefully when the flame strikes, if all the preconditions have been laid properly, then it has a better chance of catching. So yes, a certain set of and the propositions in Dialogos are very instrumental, right? They're not really precious. We don't cling to them very preciously. They are often discarded and traded and abused and cast aside because the propositional statements, those statements that could be said to be true or false, are only instrumental. Their only use is to help to generate the attitudes and momentum and overall dynamic that will lead into the Dialogos. We're not meant to get hung up on them. So the propositions have their place to start to generate the movement and the momentum. The procedure obviously has its place to do the very same thing. And then the perspectives that are generated by the propositions and the procedures are hopefully generated in such a way as to allow for a participation that creates a kind of coextension of identity, which means that your sense of yourself becomes extended into the whole process in such a way that you feel like you are being spoken by the whole process, and that when you're speaking on behalf of the whole process. You're still who you are, but you're somehow blended with the process itself because of a perspective you were able to assume, a perspective that contains within it the latitude to broaden and be reciprocally opened by the perspectives that are opposite you. So you take a perspective almost ironically. There's an ironic nature to all of this, because you take a perspective ironically, knowing that you may very likely be required to abandon it, to cast it aside, to outgrow it, to shed it off again, right? And that's what you referred to proleptic rationality before, which is not, that's a term by Agnes Callard. It has to do with aspiration. But without going into it or explaining it, it has something to do with the idea that the perspective that you're tending to, that you're searching for, is the perspective that is yet unacquired. It's the one you don't yet have, right?
Yeah.
And so when you're situating a perspective in dialogue, you're situating the perspective so that you'll be able to outgrow it. You're putting yourself in a position of wanting to supersede, right?
I wasn't going to try to bring that in, but I'm glad you remembered it, because that was the last quote I didn't read out, and proleptic rationality is another mouthful.
Yeah.
But it's what Christopher just said. It has something to do with, I want to be a better person. And so if I'm a better person, logically, I'm going to be on some level a different person, which means I don't know how I'm going to be. And yet, if I want to improve, I have to be oriented to something I don't yet know. And so, because if anyone gets this far and is still listening, hopefully they're not just thinking, well, I'm trying to decide if I'll want to go to one of these workshops or not. It's like, there's, when you said at a certain point we discard the rules, it's because isn't this something to do with how we're hoping in the midst of the meaning crisis, more people will learn how to relate to each other in daily life? Isn't that kind of what it's all about?
Yeah, I mean, learn how to relate to each other in daily life, certainly, and learn how to relate to ourselves in daily life,
and not learn how because Christopher knows how we should relate to everyone, but this process shows us something about relationship that it's somehow the process itself. Yeah,
because it's both. I mean, when it's firing on its cylinders, it's both. It's a humbling process, right? It's kind of stripping you down a little bit. It's actually, that's part of the vulnerability of the process, right? It's showing you that you're not all that you're presenting to be. You're not all that you're not the sum total of whatever it is that you're professing in that moment. That there's part of you that is reacting in such a way that is that its meanings are partly obscured. They're not always clear. What we mean when we speak isn't always clear. What we mean by these virtues isn't always clear, right? Just because we profess something doesn't mean that we understand its volumes. And because we don't necessarily understand its volumes when we speak in reference to ourselves, we also don't understand how to speak in reference to ourselves or to one another, right? So it's all unfolded, I would say, into the same process. It's using this as a little container to magnify the impressions that we're able to obtain of one another and of ourselves when we put something in the middle of us that we have to find, that is deeply complex and difficult to find because it can be aspectualized, meaning it can be perceived or understood in so many different variously in so many different ways. And so putting something like a virtue at the center of that practice, something that is various, something that has so many aspects, something that cannot be compassed except by walking around it over and over and over and over again. And by putting something in between our perspectives that eludes all of those perspectives, forces us to be ironic about those perspectives we take, and forces us into a position of humility, of having to bend ourselves around something that emerges from the blind spots in the margins, and that's the name of the game, really.
I love that. There's too many ways that could be a jumping off point for so many more things, but the emergence from the blind spot, I think a lot of people could probably relate to how that would be a really nice thing. There's just, it's been my experience. This has illuminated so much. So I'm so grateful to you for helping me to learn this practice. Of course, I'm grateful that I got to learn more about it directly today in a participatory way with you. It's just beautiful. I'll just see if, in the last moment before I know you need to run, if there's final thoughts here. We'll make the link to the essay available, but any other thing that you'd like to highlight for people who are listening, just, before we go. Anything?
No, I just thank you. It's been great just getting to know you a little bit more and your own practice. First of all, thank you for that. Most of it was before we started recording, but I really appreciate the introduction to it. And I haven't had a chance to take a thorough look and walk around some of what you've sent me, but I shall do that. And I think after doing that, it would be great to maybe chat again. I'm sorry that my own time constraints have kind of forced us to abbreviate this a bit, but
that was very generous.
I'd be more than keen to chat again. There's always more to say about this. And one thing I would say is that I think of myself as a student in all of this. Period. Full stop. Like I'm just I'm learning and improvising as I go, like the rest of us. So I make no claim to knowledge about any of this. All I am is just a student alongside, and we're all just giving this a shot together. So yeah, so no, I think that's probably all from me, but just thank you for your graciousness, really.
Thank you for yours. All right, well, we'll end it here, Christopher, and I look forward to that next conversation.
I look forward to it as well, Seth, and I'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Yeah, take care.